October 14th, 1943. The sky over Schweinfurt, Germany, belongs to death. 60 B-17 flying fortresses do not come home. 17 more limp back to England so badly damaged they will never fly again. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force loses 600 men. 600 fathers and sons and brothers, gone into the cold mathematics of industrial warfare. In the briefing rooms back in England, the surviving crews sit in silence. Their hands shake as they light cigarettes. Some cannot stop the shaking even hours later. They have seen their friends' bombers explode in midair. They have watched parachutes blossom and then collapse as German fighters strafe men hanging defenseless in the sky. They have counted the empty chairs at dinner and know that tomorrow there will be more. The losses are unsustainable. Everyone knows it. The bomber offensive against Germany is bleeding to death at 25,000 feet, and unless something changes, the entire strategic bombing campaign will collapse under the weight of its own casualties. But the solution is not what anyone expects. The answer will not come from better guns or faster escorts or tactical brilliance. It will come from a quiet refugee mathematician sitting in an office at Columbia University, a man who will look at the same data everyone else is studying and see something completely different. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Something invisible. Something that everyone else has missed because they are asking the wrong question. His name is Abraham Wald, and he is about to teach the military establishment how to think about survival. The problem seems obvious to everyone. American bombers are getting torn apart over Europe. Every mission, dozens of aircraft return to their bases in England with battle damage. Bullet holes riddle the fuselage. Shrapnel tears through the wings. Cannon fire punches holes in the tail sections. The aircraft look like flying colanders, barely holding together, somehow still, airborne despite the punishment they have absorbed. The military brass sees these damaged bombers landing and reaches a natural conclusion. They need armor. More armor. Better armor. Protection for the crews who are dying up there. But armor is heavy. Every pound of steel plate means 1 less pound of bombs, 1 less pound of fuel, 1 less pound of ammunition for the defensive guns. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is already operating at the margins of what its 4 Wright Cyclone engines can handle. Each engine produces 1,200 horsepower, impressive for 1943, but there are limits. Add too much weight and the bomber cannot reach operational altitude. Add too much weight and it cannot carry enough fuel to reach Germany and return. Add too much weight and the formation flying becomes impossible, making the aircraft easy prey for Luftwaffe fighters. So the engineers face a brutal calculus. They have limited weight budget for armor. Maybe a few £100 total. They must choose where to place that protection to save the most lives. Put it in the wrong places and men die anyway. Put it in the right places and the bombers become survivable. The obvious approach is to study the damage patterns, see where the planes are getting hit, armor those vulnerable areas. It is logical, it is straightforward. It is what any reasonable engineer would conclude, and it is completely wrong, but nobody realizes that yet. In the summer of 1943, the Army Air Forces launches a comprehensive study of combat damage. Technical crews swarm over every bomber that returns from missions over occupied Europe. They document every bullet hole, every piece of shrapnel damage, every torn section of aluminum skin. They measure the size of the holes. They record the precise location on the aircraft. They photograph everything from multiple angles. They compile thousands of data points into detailed diagrams showing exactly where German fighters and flak batteries are hitting American bombers. The patterns emerge quickly. The data is consistent across different bomb groups, different targets, different missions. The fuselage shows heavy damage. Holes everywhere. Some small from machine gun fire, some large from 20mm and 30mm cannon shells. The wings show concentrated damage, particularly near where they join the fuselage. The control surfaces, the ailerons and elevators and rudders, are often peppered with hits. The tail sections, both vertical and horizontal stabilizers, show extensive damage. But some areas show surprisingly little damage. The engines, those massive radial power plants hanging off the wings, show relatively few hits. Not zero, but far fewer than expected given their size and prominence. The cockpit area, despite being right up front where it seems most exposed, shows less damage than the fuselage. The fuel systems, those vulnerable tanks carrying hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation, gasoline, show fewer hits than predicted. The engineers compile their statistics into bar charts and detailed technical drawings. The fuselage, wings, and tail sections top every chart. The engines, cockpit, and fuel systems sit at the bottom. The conclusion seems inescapable. Armour should go on the parts taking the most hits. Reinforce the fuselage where the majority of damage occurs. Strengthen the wings that are getting shredded by fighters. Protect the tail sections that show consistent battle damage. Any engineer examining the data would reach the same conclusion. The numbers are clear. The logic is sound. The recommendation is obvious. Add armour to the areas showing the most damage on returning aircraft. It should be routine. A few weeks of analysis to confirm the patterns, then implementation. Steel plate manufacturers can be contracted. Installation procedures can be developed. Modified bombers can start rolling out of depots within months. The proposal goes to the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University for final analysis. This is standard procedure for major technical decisions. Let the mathematicians verify the numbers, confirm the statistical significance, then proceed to production. It should take a few days, maybe a week at most. Then approval, then implementation, then hopefully fewer crews dying over Germany. But Abraham Wald looks at the data and sees something nobody else sees. The Statistical Research Group occupies offices in a nondescript building on Columbia's campus in Manhattan. To outsiders, it looks like ordinary academic space. Chalkboards covered with equations, tables strewn with papers and slide rules, the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. But this is not peacetime academia where problems can wait for next semester's publication. This is war work. Urgent, classified, vital. The SRG is arguably the most brilliant collection of mathematical minds ever assembled for a single purpose. 18 researchers, each a specialist who will go on to transform their field. Milton Friedman, who will revolutionize economic theory and win the Nobel Prize. Harold Hotelling, already a legend in mathematical statistics. Alan Wallace, who keeps the daily research focused on practical military applications. And working alongside these luminaries, a quiet Austrian refugee who escaped the Nazis by the narrowest of margins and now fights them with equations instead of bullets. Abraham Wald was born on October 31st, 1902, in Kolozsvár, Transylvania, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family were Orthodox Jews, deeply religious, observant of commandments including keeping the Sabbath. From Friday evening to Saturday evening, no work was permitted. No writing, no travelling, no attending school. But the Hungarian school system had no flexibility. Classes were held 6 days a week, including Saturday. There were no exceptions for religious observance. So Wald's parents made an impossible choice. They chose their faith. Abraham was homeschooled by his parents and older siblings from early childhood through university age. This could have been a disaster. Homeschooling in the early 1900s, without modern resources or curricula, was an enormous gamble. But Wald's family gave him a rigorous education that would have challenged students in the best schools. Mathematics, where young Abraham showed immediate brilliance. Sciences, languages, philosophy and logic, religious studies. By the time he was ready for university, he had not just kept pace with formally schooled students, he had surpassed them. He enrolled at the University of Kolozsvár in 1923 to study mathematics. He excelled in every course. He graduated in 1928 with distinction. Then he moved to Vienna, the intellectual capital of Central Europe, to pursue his doctorate. He studied under Carl Menger, a legendary mathematician pioneering new fields. Wald earned his doctorate in 1931 with a dissertation on geometry that showed remarkable originality. He was 28 years old. He was brilliant. He was creative. He could see mathematical connections that others missed. Any university in Europe should have been fortunate to hire him. But this was Vienna in the 1930s. This was Europe sliding toward catastrophe. Anti-Semitism was rising like a dark tide across the continent. Jewish scholars, regardless of their talents, faced systematic barriers to academic positions. Universities had quotas limiting Jewish faculty. Departments openly refused to hire Jews. Abraham Wald, despite his doctorate, despite his brilliance, could not get a university appointment. Not because his work was inadequate, because he was Jewish. He worked instead as a mathematics tutor to a wealthy banker named Karl Schlesinger. It was steady work, reasonably paid, but it was a waste of extraordinary talent. Later, Oskar Morgenstern, director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, recognized Wald's abilities and created an economics position for him. Wald began applying his mathematical skills to economic problems, publishing papers, building a reputation. But he was still shut out of academia proper. Then came March 1938. The Anschluss, the annexation. German troops crossed into Austria on March 12th. They met no resistance. Many Austrians welcomed them with cheers and Nazi salutes. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. For Austria's Jews, this was not political change. This was existential threat. The Nazis immediately implemented their racial laws. Jewish professionals were fired within days. Jewish businesses were confiscated. Jewish people were beaten in the streets while police watched. Synagogues were vandalized. Abraham Wald understood what was coming. That summer, just months after the Anschluss, he fled Austria for America. He left behind almost everything: his home, his work, his professional network. Most devastating, he left behind his parents, his siblings, most of his extended family. They could not all get visas. Someone had to stay. He promised to send for them. He never saw most of them again. All but one of the 9 family members who remained in Austria would die at Auschwitz. In 1938, Wald was invited by the Cowles Commission for Research in Economics to serve as a research fellow in Colorado Springs. By September, he had moved to Columbia University in New York as a Carnegie Corporation fellow under Harold Hotelling. This became his home. He joined the faculty as associate professor, then full professor. After years of discrimination and displacement, he was finally where he belonged, teaching, researching, creating new mathematics. When World War II began, America mobilized its intellectual firepower. The Statistical Research Group was formally established at Columbia with charter members recognized on July 1, 1942. The SRG tackled problems that could save lives: optimal pursuit curves for torpedoes, quality control for ammunition, sequential testing methodologies, and one of the most urgent problems, the bomber survivability crisis. Allied bombers were being destroyed at catastrophic rates. In October 1943 alone, during what became known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 bombers in 7 days. October 8th through October 14th, Bremen, Anklam, Marienburg, Münster. And finally, on October 14th, the second raid on Schweinfurt, Black Thursday. On that single day, 60 B-17 seconds were shot down. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. 600 men lost, 1,500 airmen gone during that terrible week. Killed, wounded, missing, captured. Most bomber crews had a life expectancy of 11 missions. They were required to fly 25 missions to complete their tour and go home. The mathematics was brutal. With an 11-mission life expectancy and a 25-mission requirement, only about 1 in 4 crews would statistically survive. The military needed solutions urgently. They needed to know where to add armor to the bombers. The engineers examined hundreds of returning aircraft and documented the damage patterns. They compiled detailed diagrams showing where bullets and shrapnel were hitting. The data seemed clear: heavy damage to fuselage, wings and tail sections, light damage to engines, cockpit and fuel systems. The obvious conclusion was to armor the heavily damaged areas. The proposal came to the Statistical Research Group for verification. It should have been routine. But Abraham Wald sat in a room with engineers and military officers and other statisticians, looking at the same diagrams everyone else was studying. Silhouettes of bombers covered with dots marking damage locations. Everyone in the room saw the same patterns. Everyone except Wald. He studied the diagrams for a long time. He asked questions about methodology, about which planes were being examined, about data collection procedures. And then he asked a question so simple, so obvious, yet so profound that it changed everything. A question that should have occurred to someone but somehow had not. Where are the planes with engine damage? The question hung in the air. The other men looked at each other, confused. What did he mean? The data clearly showed that engines had less damage. Everyone could see it right there in the numbers. But Wald pushed further. These diagrams show only the planes that came back. What about the planes that did not come back? Where were they hit? Everyone else in that room looked at returning planes and saw damage patterns indicating vulnerability. Wald looked at returning planes and saw selection bias. Enormous, glaring selection bias that everyone had missed. These were the survivors. These were the lucky ones. These were the planes that made it home despite being damaged. What about the planes that did not make it home? Where were they hit? What killed them? The engineers were analysing a biased sample without realising it. They were studying only planes that survived combat and returned to England. The planes that got shot down were not available for study. Those planes were scattered across Europe, crashed in German fields, burning in French forests, sunk in the English Channel, blown apart at altitude. Their damage patterns could not be documented. Their crews could not report what hit them. Their data was missing, gone, lost. And that missing data was the most important data of all. Wald realized something crucial about the data collection process. If returning planes showed heavy damage to the fuselage, wings, and tail, that meant something very specific. It meant these areas could absorb significant damage and still allow the plane to fly home. A bomber could take dozens of holes through the fuselage and keep flying. The crew might be terrified. There might be wounded men bleeding in the back, but the aircraft remained controllable. The engines kept running. The pilots could still fly it home. Holes in the wings were serious, but often not fatal. The wings on a B-17 were massive structures with multiple spars and ribs. You could punch many holes through them before the wing failed structurally. The planes were surviving with hits to those areas. That was what the data actually revealed. Not that these areas were vulnerable and needed protection, but that these areas could sustain damage without bringing the plane down. But the engines showed little damage on returning planes. Why? Not because engines were less likely to be hit. Wald understood that German fighters and flak aimed at the entire aircraft. Hits in combat were distributed fairly randomly across the bomber. There was no reason engines would be magically protected or harder to hit. They were big, obvious targets hanging off the wings. Fighters, specifically, aimed for them. Flak exploded near them. So, why did returning planes show so little engine damage? The answer was chilling. The engines showed little damage on returning planes because planes hit in the engines did not return. They went down. A hit to an engine could start an uncontrollable fire. High-octane aviation fuel fed the flames. The engine broke apart. With one engine gone, maybe the pilot could limp home if close to friendly territory. With two engines gone on the same wing, the plane became uncontrollable. It rolled over and dove into the ground. The same logic applied to the cockpit. Few returning planes showed cockpit damage, not because it was well protected. The cockpit was right up front, where fighters loved to make head-on attacks. The entire nose was glazed with clear panels. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Fighters could see the pilots. They aimed for them, trying to kill the crew controlling the aircraft. So why did returning planes show limited cockpit damage? Because when the cockpit took a direct hit, when bullets killed or incapacitated both pilots, the plane did not come home. It crashed. Everyone died. The fuel systems showed the same pattern. The fuel tanks held hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. One tracer round, one incendiary shell, one piece of hot shrapnel hitting a fuel tank could turn the entire bomber into a flying torch. Crews called it cooking off. The plane would ignite, flames spreading instantly through fuel vapor. The crew had seconds to bail out if lucky. Most were not lucky. Planes with severe fuel system damage did not make it back to England. They burned over Germany or crashed in the Channel. The absence of engine damage on surviving planes was not evidence that engines were safe. It was evidence that engine damage was fatal. The absence of cockpit damage was not evidence that cockpits were well protected. It was evidence that cockpit damage killed the crew and doomed the plane. The absence of fuel system damage was not evidence that fuel tanks were secure. It was evidence that damaged fuel systems led to catastrophic fires. Wald had identified a profound statistical principle that would later become known as survivorship bias. When you study only survivors, you miss the most important information: the failures, the casualties, the ones who did not make it. Those missing cases often have the most to teach you. They are absent from your sample not randomly, but for systematic reasons related to the very thing you are trying to understand. His conclusion was stark and counterintuitive. Armor should not go on the parts with the most damage on returning planes. It should go on the parts with the least damage on returning planes. The engines, the cockpit, the fuel systems, the parts that, when hit, prevented planes from coming home at all. If a plane could survive hits to the fuselage and still fly home, the fuselage was not the critical vulnerability. But if planes hit in the engines never came home, then engines were the critical vulnerability. This was backward from what everyone expected. It contradicted the obvious interpretation of the visible data. But Wald was right. The engineers had been about to make a catastrophic mistake. They were about to armor exactly the wrong parts of the aircraft. They would have added weight to areas that were already survivable, while leaving truly vulnerable areas unprotected. Bombers would have been heavier, carrying less fuel and bombs, and no safer than before. More crews would have died. All because nobody had thought to ask about the missing data. Wald wrote technical memoranda for the statistical research group analyzing damage distribution on aircraft. These were not simple documents. They were densely technical, filled with equations and statistical proofs. He developed mathematical methods to estimate damage distribution for all aircraft, including those shot down, using only data from survivors. This required sophisticated statistical inference. He had to work backward from biased data to infer what complete unbiased data would look like. His papers were classified during the war for security reasons. The enemy could not know how American operational research was improving bomber survivability. The documents remained classified for decades after the war ended. They were finally declassified in the late 1970s. In 1980, the Center for Naval Analyses published Wald's complete wartime memoranda. Researchers could finally examine the original work in detail. The Statistical Research Group operated under a specific policy. They were analysts, not military commanders. Their job was to analyze data and answer questions, not make explicit military recommendations. That was for officers to decide. So Wald's memoranda presented the statistical analysis and showed what the data implied, but stopped short of direct orders. The implications were clear to anyone who read them. But final decisions belonged to military officers who understood aircraft design, production constraints, and operational requirements. The military used Wald's statistical methods through the rest of World War II. His approach to analyzing battle damage became standard procedure. The principles he established became embedded in military operational research for decades. Question your sample selection. Think about missing data. Consider what you cannot see. Ask why certain data is available and other data is not. His work was used in the Korean War when new aircraft needed armor assessment. It was used in the Vietnam War when helicopter survivability became critical. It was used every time the military had to decide how to protect aircraft, vehicles, or personnel. The methods were taught at military academies and war colleges. Officers learned to think like Wald, to see not just the data in front of them, but the invisible data hidden by survivorship. But Wald's contribution went far beyond bomber armor. He had identified one of the most important concepts in statistics and critical thinking: survivorship bias. The systematic error that occurs when you study only successes, only survivors, only winners, and forget that failures have information too. Perhaps the most important information. This insight applies far beyond military operations. In business, we study successful companies and read case studies about winning strategies. But we rarely examine the thousands of companies that tried identical strategies and failed. They went bankrupt. They closed. They are not here to tell their stories. We see only the survivors and draw conclusions from incomplete data. In medicine, clinical studies can suffer from survivorship bias. If you only study patients who survive to reach the hospital, you miss the most severe cases, the ones who died before arrival. This leads to underestimating the deadliness of conditions and wrong conclusions about which treatments work best. In finance, mutual funds that close due to poor performance disappear from historical comparisons. When you evaluate average mutual fund returns, you only see funds that survived. The failures are not in the data. This inflates performance statistics and misleads investors. Abraham Wald taught us to ask the uncomfortable question: what am I not seeing? What data is missing? What failures am I ignoring because they are not here to be counted? These questions require us to imagine what is not there, to think about the invisible, to remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This requires unusual thinking. You have to look at what is in front of you and simultaneously imagine what is not there. You have to analyze the data you have while also analyzing the data you do not have. Most people cannot do this naturally. Wald could. He had spent his life seeing patterns others missed. From his homeschooled childhood, learning to think independently, through his years of mathematical research, finding connections in geometry and economics, to his wartime work where he looked at bomber damage and saw the invisible planes that never came home. After the war, Wald continued his groundbreaking work at Columbia. He was now recognized as one of the leading statisticians in America. His wartime work had proven the power of mathematical thinking applied to real problems. In 1947, he published a book that would transform statistics: Sequential Analysis. This work grew directly from his wartime research on how to make reliable decisions with limited data. Traditional statistical methods required deciding your sample size in advance. You would test exactly 100 subjects or measure exactly 1,000 parts, then analyze all results at once. This approach wasted resources. Sometimes you could reach a confident conclusion with far less data, but traditional methods forced you to collect the entire predetermined sample anyway. Wald showed how you could make reliable decisions with less data by analyzing results as they came in. You could stop collecting data when you had enough evidence to reach a decision with confidence. This saved time, money, and materials. In medical trials, it saved lives by allowing effective treatments to be identified faster and harmful treatments to be stopped sooner. The methodology he developed became standard across countless fields. Medical trials testing new drugs, quality control in manufacturing, industrial testing of materials. Anywhere decisions must be made with uncertain information and the cost of data collection matters. Wald's sequential analysis changed how the work was done. By 1950, Abraham Wald had become one of the most respected statisticians in the world. He had transformed multiple fields. He had trained a generation of students who would carry his methods forward. He had proven that pure mathematical thinking could solve real-world problems and save lives. That year, the Indian government invited him to a lecture on statistics. Wald was scheduled to address the Indian Science Congress in Bangalore and visit the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata. He arrived in India in November 1950 with his wife Lucille. Their two children, Betty and Robert, remained home in the United States. The trip was scheduled for a few months. Wald expected to return to Colombia in mid-February. December 13th, 1950. Wald and his wife boarded an Air India flight, a Douglas C-47. The plane was flying from Bombay to Trivandrum, with a stop in Madras. It was a scheduled commercial flight, routine and safe, but something went wrong over southern India, near the town of Kotagiri in the Nilgiri Mountains. The plane flew into the side of a mountain. Navigation error. The pilots did not see the terrain until too late. The aircraft crashed in a rocky valley below Rangaswamy Peak, approximately 8 miles from Kotagiri at 6,000 feet elevation. All 21 people aboard died, instantly. 17 passengers, 4 crew. The wreckage was not found for a week. The terrain was so difficult that bodies could not be removed. They were buried at the crash site. Abraham Wald was 48 years old. The loss devastated the mathematical community. Obituaries appeared in leading journals worldwide. His colleague Oscar Morgenstern wrote a tribute in Econometrica. The Indian Statistical Institute held a memorial service. Columbia University mourned one of its brightest minds, but his legacy would prove immortal. His papers from World War II continued to influence military strategy for decades. Every time the military had to make decisions about armoring vehicles or aircraft, they consulted Wald's work. His methods were taught at military academies and war colleges. His concept of survivorship bias became one of the most important ideas in statistics, decision theory, and critical thinking. Today, more than 70 years after Wald did his analysis, survivorship bias affects how we understand success and failure across countless domains. When we study winners, we must remember the losers who are not there to study. When we analyze survivors, we must think about those who did not survive. When we see data, we must ask what data is missing. In business, survivorship bias creates a false picture of what strategies work. We study successful companies and learn from CEOs who took bold risks and won big. But for every CEO whose risk-taking led to billions, there were dozens whose identical risk-taking led to bankruptcy. Those failed CEOs do not write memoirs. They do not give speeches. Their companies are gone. They are the missing planes. And because we only study the survivors, we conclude that their strategies must work, never realizing that survivorship bias is hiding all the failures. In medicine, clinical studies that only examine patients who survived to reach the hospital miss the most severe cases. The patients who died before arrival are not in the data. This leads to systematically underestimating how dangerous conditions are and reaching wrong conclusions about which treatments work best. Hospital-based studies see a biased sample, the survivors, just like the engineers studying returning bombers. In finance, mutual funds that close due to poor performance disappear from historical comparisons. When you evaluate average fund returns, you only see funds that survived. The failures are not there anymore. This inflates performance statistics by an estimated 1 to 2% per year. Compounded over decades, this makes an enormous difference to retirement savings. Every success story hides untold failures. Every survivor represents many who did not survive. Every data point you can see exists alongside countless data points you cannot see. Wald taught us a way of thinking that goes beyond bomber armor. He taught us to question our samples, to ask whether what we observe is representative or biased, to consider selection effects, to think about what process generated the data we have access to and what that process might be hiding. In 1943, young men climbed into bombers every morning not knowing if they would see another sunset. The military looked at bullet holes and saw obvious solutions. They saw damaged fuselages and wings and tails. The data seemed clear. The conclusion appeared obvious. They were about to armor exactly the wrong parts of their aircraft. But Abraham Wald looked at the same data and saw something different. He saw the planes that were not there. He saw the missing bullet holes. He saw the invisible truth hiding in plain sight. He asked the question no one else thought to ask. Where are the planes with engine damage? Why are they not here? What does their absence tell us? It was not magic. It was disciplined thinking. It was rigorous mathematics applied with creativity and insight. It was the willingness to question assumptions everyone else took for granted. And because he looked beyond the obvious, because he questioned what everyone accepted, because he asked about what was missing instead of just analyzing what was present, his insight helped protect American airmen flying into danger, not through advanced weapons, not through better tactics, but through clear thinking, through asking the right question. That is the legacy of Abraham Wald. Not just his mathematical brilliance, though that was extraordinary. Not just his contributions to statistics and operational research, though those were groundbreaking. His true legacy is teaching us to see what is not there, teaching us that the most important data is often the data we cannot collect, teaching us that the most important lessons come from the failures that did not survive to teach us. In a room full of brilliant minds, Abraham Wald was the one who asked the different question. He was the one who saw past the obvious. He was the mathematician who saw what everyone else missed. And in seeing it, in that one crucial insight about missing data and survivorship bias, he changed how we think about evidence. He gave us a tool for avoiding systematic errors in reasoning. He taught us that sometimes the most important thing in the room is the thing that is not there. The bullet holes were on the planes that came back, but the lesson, the profound and lasting lesson, was in the planes that did not. In the missing data, in the invisible evidence, Abraham Wald taught us to look for the missing planes, to ask about what is not there, to see the invisible, and that lesson continues to save lives more than 70 years later. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.